My father told me I wasn't his real daughter to cut me out of my grandmother's will. Only blood relatives deserve the family fortune, he declared. So I looked at him and said, "Do you promise to keep your word about it?" Then he said, "Yes." He had a big surprise when "You're not even her real granddaughter," my father spat, his face contorted with rage. Only blood relatives deserve the family fortune. I stood frozen in Grandmother Margaret's study, the heavy oak shelves filled with leather-bound classics surrounding us like silent witnesses to his cruelty. My grandmother had been buried only 3 days ago, and already the family was fracturing over her will. "What are you talking about?" I managed, my voice barely audible over the thundering of my heart. "Don't play innocent, Emily. Your mother's little secret isn't so secret anymore." He paced the oriental rug, pausing to glare at the formal portrait of grandmother hanging above the fireplace. "Margaret was obsessed with bloodlines. Once the lawyer confirms you've got no Carter blood, you'll get nothing." I looked him directly in the eyes, fighting to keep my voice steady. "Do you promise to keep your word about this? That only blood relatives deserve grandmother's inheritance?" "Absolutely," he declared, lifting his chin with the same imperious tilt I'd seen countless times throughout my childhood. "I'll make sure the family legacy stays with real Carters, not imposters. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 27 years old, and until 5 minutes ago, I believed Richard Carter was my biological father. Now, standing in my grandmother's Georgian mansion in suburban Philadelphia, I was apparently discovering otherwise. What I wanted was simple: the fair treatment Grandmother Margaret intended in her will. She had specifically mentioned me, her only granddaughter, during our last conversation about her estate plans. Standing in my way was the man who had always viewed me with thinly veiled contempt, the man whose approval I had spent decades trying to earn unsuccessfully. "You can attend the will reading next week if you must," he continued dismissively, "but don't expect anything. I've already spoken with Lawrence about challenging any provisions that include you." Lawrence Bennett was my father's longtime friend and our family attorney. The mention of their apparent collusion sent a chill through me. "I'll be there," I replied quietly. "Grandmother wanted me there." "Sentiment," he scoffed. "Margaret always had a blind spot for you. Fortunately, the law cares about facts, not feelings." As he strode from the room, I sank into grandmother's desk chair, running my fingers over the polished walnut surface where she had written countless letters, reviewed business documents, and, most recently, finalized her will. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "We need to talk about your father tonight. Alone." I stared at the message, unease crawling up my spine. If my father wasn't my biological father, then who was? And how had this secret remained hidden for 27 years? More importantly, why was it surfacing now, just days after grandmother's death and days before her fortune would be distributed? Whatever truth awaited me, one thing was becoming clear. The father I had spent my life trying to please had been harboring resentment far deeper than I had ever realized. Growing up as a Carter meant navigating a world of privilege and weighty expectations. The Carter fortune, built on pharmaceutical patents and shrewd investments, had sustained 3 generations of the family in considerable luxury. My father, Richard, was the elder of 2 sons, which automatically positioned him as the presumptive heir to the majority of the Carter assets. His younger brother, Henry, had been the family rebel, brilliant but restless, unwilling to conform to our grandfather's rigid vision of the family legacy. He left Philadelphia to pursue medical research in Seattle, returning only occasionally for major family events. My memories of Uncle Henry were limited but warm, his easy laugh, thoughtful gifts, and the way he'd speak to me as though my opinions mattered. In contrast, my relationship with my father had always been strained. Richard Carter was a man who measured worth in achievements and status. My brothers, Edward and Charles, had fulfilled his expectations admirably, Edward following him into the family business, Charles excelling in law school. I, however, had disappointed him at every turn. "She lacks the Carter drive," he'd remarked to my mother when he thought I couldn't hear. "Too soft, too unfocused. Despite graduating with honors and establishing a promising career in historical preservation, nothing I accomplished seemed to meet his standard. I'd attributed this perpetual disappointment to sexism or perhaps unrealistic expectations, never imagining there might be a more fundamental reason for his distance. Grandmother Margaret had been my sanctuary. Unlike my father, she valued my interest in history and art, encouraging me to pursue a path that honored my passions rather than family tradition. During my undergraduate years, I'd visit her estate every Sunday for tea, listening to her stories of family history and her own quiet rebellions against the constraints placed on women of her generation. "Remember, Emily," she often told me, "a Carter makes their own path." Her death at 86 had been peaceful but left an emptiness I was still struggling to navigate. The knowledge that I'd lost my greatest advocate within the family made her absence even more profound. In the days following her funeral, I'd noticed subtle changes in my father's behavior, heightened scrutiny when I interacted with other family members, hushed conversations with Lawrence Bennett that abruptly ended when I entered a room. I dismissed these observations as grief manifesting in different ways, but now they took on a more sinister significance. The last time I'd seen grandmother alive, she'd held my hand with surprising strength and whispered, "Trust your instincts, Emily. Not everything is as it appears." At the time, I'd attributed her cryptic words to medication or fatigue. Now I wondered if she'd been trying to prepare me for the storm that was about to break over our family. As I left grandmother's study to meet my mother, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn into a family drama decades in the making, one with roots deeper than I could yet comprehend. My mother was waiting for me at her favorite cafe, tucked away in a quiet corner of the city where Carters were just ordinary people. She looked smaller somehow, her usually impeccable appearance slightly disheveled, eyes shadowed by sleepless nights. "I never wanted you to find out this way," she began without preamble, her fingers nervously turning her wedding band. "Your father, Richard, shouldn't have told you like that. It was cruel and self-serving." "So it's true?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "He's not my biological father?" She nodded, tears gathering in her eyes. "It's complicated, Emily. More complicated than Richard makes it sound." Over the next hour, my mother unraveled a story that upended everything I thought I knew about my family. She and Henry, my uncle, had been in love before she met Richard. They'd been young, passionate, and planning a future together. When Henry received a prestigious research fellowship in Seattle, he should go, she explained. It was an incredible opportunity. We thought we could manage the distance, but the separation had strained their relationship, and during a particularly difficult period, she'd grown close to Richard, who had always admired her from afar. A moment of vulnerability led to a brief relationship when she ended when she realized her heart still belonged to Henry. When I discovered I was pregnant, I was certain it was Henry's child. The timing aligned perfectly with his last visit home. Her voice trembled, but Richard insisted the child was his, and Henry was already engaged to someone else by then. I didn't want to disrupt his new life. Richard had proposed immediately, presenting their marriage as the honorable solution. Only later did my mother realize that his interest had never been entirely about her. The Carter fortune had strict inheritance provisions that favored male heirs with legitimate children. "He needed a wife and children to secure his position," she said bitterly, "and I needed stability for my baby." It seemed like the best option at the time. Years passed, and the secret held. Henry eventually moved back to Philadelphia with his wife, but they remained childless. When his marriage ended in divorce, he threw himself into medical research, becoming increasingly distant from family affairs. "Did Henry ever know?" I asked. "No," my mother whispered. "I couldn't bear to disrupt his life again." And as the years passed, it seemed crueler to reveal the truth. The revelation left me reeling. Every memory of childhood now required re-examination. My father's coldness, Uncle Henry's warmth during his rare visits, Grandmother Margaret's special attention to me. Why is Richard revealing this now? I finally asked. My mother's expression hardened. Your grandmother's will. He's always been obsessed with the Carter fortune, and now he's worried Margaret might have left you a significant portion. He needs to discredit your claim. But if I'm not a blood Carter, that's just it, she interrupted. You are a Carter by blood, just not Richard's child. You're Henry's daughter, which makes you Margaret's granddaughter by blood regardless. The irony was almost too perfect. My father's attempt to cut me out of the inheritance by denying our biological connection might actually strengthen my claim through a different branch of the family tree. What do I do now? I asked, feeling adrift in this new reality. My mother reached across the table to clasp my hands. That depends on what you want, Emily. Justice, acknowledgement, or simply your fair share of what Margaret intended for you? I didn't have an answer yet. The betrayal was too fresh, the implications too vast to process in a single conversation. But as we left the cafe, one certainty crystallized in my mind. I would not allow Richard Carter to rewrite my history for his financial gain. The question was how to prove my true parentage before the will reading, and whether that truth would help or harm my position in the complex web of Carter inheritance rules. The next morning, I drove to Uncle Henry's apartment, heart hammering against my ribs. I had called ahead, keeping my reason vague family matters to discuss before the will reading. Now, sitting in his modest living room surrounded by scientific journals and travel mementos, I struggled to find the words to upend his world alongside mine. You seem troubled, Emily, he observed, setting 2 cups of tea on the coffee table. At 58, Henry Carter remained handsome, with the same dark eyes I saw in my mirror every morning. Is Richard making things difficult about Margaret's estate? It's more complicated than that, I began, then faltered. How did one ask a man if he might be your biological father? Uncle Henry, did you and my mother were you ever together before she married father? The cup froze halfway to his lips, his expression shifting from surprise to guarded caution. Why would you ask about ancient history now? Because Richard has informed me that he's not my biological father, and he's using that claim to challenge my place in grandmother's will. Henry set his cup down with deliberate care. That sounds like Richard calculating, even in cruelty. He studied my face with new intensity. What has your mother told you? I recounted my mother's revelations about their past relationship, watching his expressions cycle through nostalgia, pain, and something that looked remarkably like hope. I never knew, he said finally. Elizabeth never told me she was pregnant. By the time I heard about the marriage, it was already done. He leaned forward. Emily, are you saying you believe I might be your father? The timing fits, according to Mother, but Richard is determined to prove I have no Carter blood to claim my inheritance. Henry's expression darkened. Margaret's will specifically mentions you by name. Richard can't simply write you out of it. He claims he can challenge any provisions made under false pretenses, namely, that grandmother believed me to be his biological daughter. Henry rose abruptly, pacing the small room. This is absurd. Even if you were not Richard's biological child, you're still Margaret's granddaughter if you're my daughter. He stopped, meeting my gaze directly. We need to know for certain. A DNA test would settle this question definitively. The clinical simplicity of his solution both relieved and terrified me. You'd be willing to take one? Without hesitation, he replied. I've always felt a connection to you that I couldn't quite explain. If you are my daughter, his voice caught. Well, let's confirm the facts before we get ahead of ourselves. We arranged for expedited testing that same day, using a private lab that promised results within 72 hours, just enough time before the will reading. As we submitted our samples, a strange combination of dread and anticipation settled in my stomach. Regardless of the outcome, my relationship with both men would be irrevocably altered. While awaiting results, I attempted to gather information about grandmother's will. I contacted her personal attorney, George Thompson, separate from the family lawyer, Lawrence Bennett. I'm afraid I can't discuss the specific provisions before the official reading, George explained when I visited his office. But I can assure you that your grandmother was of sound mind and very clear about her intentions. Did she know? I asked directly, about my biological parentage. George's carefully neutral expression slipped momentarily. I cannot comment on that, but I will say that Margaret Carter was a remarkably perceptive woman who very little escaped her notice. His non-answer told me everything I needed to know. Grandmother had suspected, perhaps even confirmed, that I was Henry's daughter, not Richard's. My momentary triumph evaporated when I received a formal letter that evening. Lawrence Bennett had petitioned the court to delay the will reading pending resolution of identity concerns regarding purported beneficiaries. Richard was moving faster than anticipated, using his legal connections to buy time while he built his case against me. When I called George to ask about the delay, his secretary informed me he had been suddenly hospitalized with pneumonia and would be unavailable indefinitely. It couldn't be coincidence. Richard was systematically removing my potential allies and information sources. Without George or the DNA results, I would enter the will reading at a severe disadvantage. That night, my mother called in a panic. "Richard knows you met with Henry. He's furious, Emily. Be careful. When Richard feels threatened, he becomes dangerous." The DNA results arrived via encrypted email 2 days before the rescheduled will reading. With trembling fingers, I opened the document, scanning for the conclusion buried amid scientific terminology: probability of paternity, 99.999998%. Henry Carter was unquestionably my biological father. I sat back, emotions flooding through me. Vindication, grief for the relationship I never had, anger at the years of deception. The scientific confirmation transformed abstract possibility into concrete reality. Richard, the man who had coldly rejected me my entire life, was not my father at all. I immediately called Henry, who received the news with quiet emotion. "I suspected from the moment you asked," he admitted. "You have Elizabeth's smile, but those eyes, they're Carter eyes. My mother's eyes." We agreed to meet before the will reading to discuss our approach. Armed with DNA proof, I finally had leverage against Richard, or so I thought. That evening, Lawrence Bennett requested an urgent meeting at his office. Despite my misgivings, I agreed, curious about this sudden outreach from my father's legal ally. The elegant offices of Bennett and Associates signaled old money and discretion. Lawrence, silver-haired and impeccably dressed, greeted me with practiced cordiality that didn't reach his eyes. "Emily, thank you for coming. I thought we should discuss certain developments before the will reading." "You mean the fact that Richard isn't my biological father, or that you filed a frivolous petition to delay the reading?" His smile tightened. "Actually, I was referring to the DNA test you and Henry arranged." My blood ran cold. How could he possibly know about the test? We had been meticulously careful. Richard was quite distressed to learn of this independent investigation, Lawrence continued. He asked me to convey a proposal. He slid a document across his desk. It was a waiver agreement relinquishing all claims to Margaret Carter's estate in exchange for a one-time payment of $250. Oh, this is absurd, I said, pushing it back. Grandmother specifically included me in her will. Yes, under the presumption you were Richard's daughter. Now that we know otherwise, now we know I'm Henry's daughter, which makes me even more legitimately Margaret's granddaughter than if I were Richard's, I interrupted. Blood relatives deserve the family fortune. Isn't that what Richard always says? Lawrence's expression shifted. There are complexities you're unaware of. Emily, legal nuances regarding the Carter Trust that supersede simple biology. What complexities? I'm not at liberty to discuss details before the reading, but I strongly advise you to consider this offer. Richard is prepared to be quite aggressive in defending the family interests. The veiled threat hung between us. I left without signing, more determined than ever to stand my ground, but deeply unsettled by Lawrence's confidence, despite our seemingly ironclad DNA evidence. The next morning brought the revelation that shattered my understanding of the entire situation. Henry called, his voice tight with controlled fury. "Emily, I've just received some disturbing information from an old family friend, a nurse who worked with my father decades ago. He paused. Richard isn't biologically a Carter. The room seemed to tilt around me. Apparently, my parents adopted Richard as an infant after my mother had several miscarriages. When she unexpectedly became pregnant with me years later, they decided to keep the adoption quiet, not wanting Richard to feel like less than their son. The implications hit me like a physical blow. If Richard wasn't a blood Carter, then by his own logic, does Richard know? I managed. I don't think so. Our parents took the secret to their graves, but Margaret might have known. She and my mother were extremely close. That's why Lawrence was so confident, I breathed. There must be something in the will or trust documents specifying blood relations. Exactly. I've been reviewing copies of the original Carter Trust. There's a specific clause requiring direct bloodline descent for principal inheritance. Richard would have been protected by his legal adoption. But by making this about biological legitimacy, he's potentially disqualified himself. The irony was almost too perfect. Richard's attempt to disinherit me by questioning my biological connection to the Carter line could backfire catastrophically if his own adoption came to light. What do we do with this information? I asked. Henry was quiet for a moment. That depends on what you want, Emily. What Richard deserves and what's right for our family might be different things. I considered his words carefully. I think, I said slowly, that people who insist on blood purity should be held to their own standards, don't you? The morning of the will reading dawned crisp and clear. Philadelphia's autumn painting the trees in brilliant hues outside grandmother's mansion, where the family had gathered. I arrived early with Henry. Our shared secret, a fragile weapon we weren't yet certain how to deploy. Lawrence Bennett presided from the head of the dining table, leather portfolio open before him, while various Carter relatives filled the high-backed chairs. Richard sat directly opposite me, his posture radiating confidence, flanked by my brothers, who looked uncomfortable but determined to support their father. Before we begin, Lawrence announced, I must address a delicate matter regarding succession eligibility. Richard straightened, shooting me a triumphant glance. It has come to our attention that certain beneficiaries named in Margaret Carter's will may not qualify under the bloodline provisions of the original Carter Family Trust. My mother, seated beside me, gripped my hand beneath the table. Lawrence continued, As you know, Margaret's estate is divided between assets she controlled independently and those governed by the family trust established by her father. The trust specifically requires beneficiaries to be blood descendants of the Carter line, which is precisely why we need to address Emily's situation, Richard interrupted smoothly. Recent information suggests she is not my biological daughter, and therefore has no claim to the Carter inheritance. A ripple of murmurs circulated around the table. Henry and I exchanged glances, our carefully rehearsed plan suddenly derailed by Richard's preemptive strike. I have DNA evidence, Richard continued, sliding a folder toward Lawrence, confirming Emily is not my biological child. Under the bloodline requirement, she is ineligible for trust distribution. My heart pounded as Lawrence reviewed the documents. We had anticipated raising the paternity issue ourselves, but Richard had outmaneuvered us by presenting his own testing. I had never consented to or provided samples for. May I ask how you obtained my DNA for this test? I asked, fighting to keep my voice level. Richard's smile was cold. From your water glass at our last family dinner. Quite simple, really. That's illegal, Henry interjected. Unauthorized DNA testing, irrelevant to the inheritance question, Lawrence cut in. The science is sound, regardless of collection methods. I felt our carefully constructed plan crumbling. If Lawrence accepted Richard's evidence while dismissing the legality of collection, we would lose our chance to reveal the truth on our terms. I have additional evidence pertinent to the bloodline question, I said firmly, removing our own testing results from my bag. DNA confirmation that Henry Carter is my biological father. The room erupted in shocked exclamations. Richard's face contorted with fury as he turned on my mother, who met his gaze unflinchingly. "This changes nothing," Lawrence insisted after reviewing our documentation. "The trust specifies Carter blood from Margaret's direct line, which flows through her son Richard to his legitimate heirs. It was the opening we needed." Henry stood slowly, commanding the room's attention. "I believe we need to examine the precise language of the trust," he said. "My understanding is that it requires beneficiaries to be blood descendants of Harold Carter, Margaret's father. If that's the case, we have a significant problem." Lawrence frowned. "What problem?" "Richard is not biologically a Carter," Henry stated clearly. "He was adopted as an infant, a fact our parents kept private to protect him, but which Margaret was aware of." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard's face drained of color as he stared at his brother in naked shock. "That's absurd," he finally sputtered. "A desperate lie. I have the adoption records," Henry continued implacably, "and DNA confirmation." He produced another folder. "If we're applying a strict bloodline test, as Richard insists, then I am Margaret's only biological child, and Emily, as my biological daughter, is her only blood grandchild." Lawrence looked stricken as he examined the documents, his loyalty to Richard visibly warring with his professional obligations. "This is outrageous," Richard shouted, rising from his chair. "I won't stand for this slander. You're the one who insisted only blood relatives deserve the Carter fortune," I reminded him quietly. "Are you retracting that position now?" Before Richard could respond, the library doors opened to reveal a frail but determined George Thompson, grandmother's personal attorney, leaning on a cane. "I apologize for my tardiness," he said, nodding to me. "I believe my presence is required for this reading." Lawrence's dismay confirmed our suspicion. George's unexpected recovery threatened whatever legal maneuvering Richard had orchestrated in his absence. "I would like to review the documents before proceeding," George insisted, his experienced gaze already noting the tension filling the room. As George settled at the table with the various test results and adoption papers spread before him, Richard looked truly afraid for the first time. Whatever scheme he had constructed with Lawrence was rapidly unraveling, but his desperation made him unpredictable and potentially dangerous. George adjusted his reading glasses as he reviewed the final pages of Grandmother's will, his voice steady and authoritative. "Before addressing specific bequests, I must draw attention to a letter Margaret Carter instructed me to read if questions of lineage arose during this proceeding." He opened a sealed envelope, the Carter crest embossed on heavy cream paper. The room fell silent as he began to read. "To my family gathered here, if this letter is being read, then the secret I have kept for decades has finally surfaced. I have always known that Richard was not born of Carter blood, but was welcomed into our family through adoption, a noble act of love by my husband and myself after years of heartbreak. I have also known, since the moment I first held her, that Emily is Henry's biological daughter. A grandmother knows her own blood. The Carter Trust, established by my father, requires blood relation for principal inheritance. Having anticipated potential conflict, I have restructured my personal assets, which constitute the majority of what you now call the Carter fortune, to reflect my wishes rather than outdated notions of bloodline purity. To Richard, you have been my son in every way that matters. But your treatment of Emily, your brother's child, has revealed a character that dishonors the Carter name you so jealously guard. By your own insistence on blood qualification, you have disqualified yourself from what you most covet." George paused, looking directly at Richard, whose face had gone ashen. "In accordance with Margaret's explicit instructions," George continued, "and in light of the DNA evidence presented today confirming both Richard's adoption and Emily's parentage, the distribution is as follows. The trust assets requiring Carter bloodline pass to Henry Carter and his biological daughter, Emily. Margaret's personal estate will be distributed according to the specific bequests outlined here." Richard lunged for the documents, but George calmly shifted them away. "You promised!" Richard shouted at me, desperation breaking through his composed facade. "You said only blood relatives deserve the fortune." No, I corrected him quietly. You said that. I merely asked if you would keep your word about it, and you promised you would. The justice of this moment wasn't in the inheritance itself, but in watching Richard's carefully constructed reality crumble under the weight of his own hypocrisy. The aftermath of the will reading unfolded like the final act of a Greek tragedy. Richard, undone by his own machinations, stormed from the mansion, shouting threats of legal challenges that everyone present knew would fail. Lawrence Bennett followed, his professional reputation in tatters after George revealed his knowledge of the adoption records he had deliberately concealed. My brothers, stunned by the revelations, approached me uncertainly. Edward, always the more sensitive of the two, spoke first. I had no idea about any of this, he said quietly. All those years, the way he treated you, it makes a terrible kind of sense now. Charles nodded soberly. For what it's worth, you've always been our sister. That hasn't changed. Their sincerity moved me more than I expected. They had been shaped by Richard too, in different ways. Perhaps there was a relationship worth salvaging there, given time. Mother approached next, relief and apprehension mingling in her expression. I should have told you years ago, she said. You were protecting me, I finished for her. I understand that now. The most profound conversation came later that evening when Henry and I sat in grandmother's study, surrounded by the books and artifacts of a family history we were both rewriting in our minds. What will you do now? He asked, the weight of missed years heavy in his voice. Build something new, I answered simply. We can't recover the time we lost, but perhaps we can create something better going forward. He smiled, the expression so similar to my own that I wondered how I hadn't seen the resemblance before. I'd like that very much. As we talked into the night, sharing stories and discovering connections, I felt grandmother's presence in the room, her wisdom, her foresight, her absolute certainty that truth would eventually prevail. She had arranged everything perfectly, ensuring that justice would be served without requiring me to deliver it personally. In the end, Richard's downfall came not from my actions but from his own character, revealed under pressure. He had spent decades ensuring I felt like an outsider in the family, never suspecting that he was the true outsider all along. The irony was perfect, and perfectly sufficient. As I looked toward the future, a future that included a father who actually wanted me in his life, I realized that was the greatest inheritance of all.